I'm a 29-year-old guy, and if you ask my family, they'd probably say I'm the bigger person. You know, the one who always keeps the peace, never stirs the pot, smooths over arguments before they explode. Growing up, that was my unofficial job, family mediator. We were tight-knit, but let's just say that tight-knit doesn't mean perfect. My parents aren't the type to address conflict head-on. They'd rather look the other way and hope it sorts itself out. That left me, the middle child, stepping in between my older brother Jason and younger sister Emma whenever they clashed, which was often. It felt like I was in a constant balancing act, keeping everyone from going at each other's throats. But it was my grandmother who truly understood me. She was the one person in my life who made me feel seen. She'd always had this way of cutting through the noise, making me feel like my voice mattered in a family that often took it for granted. She passed away recently, and that alone has been a lot to process. But her death wasn't just a loss in the emotional sense, it came with a complication that's managed to crank up the tension in my family to a level I didn't even think was possible. She left behind an inheritance. And not just a small one. She left enough that it's caught everyone's attention, and, as it turns out, brought a lot of old grudges back to the surface. So here's the setup. My grandmother wanted her inheritance to be divided equally among her grandchildren, me, Jason, and Emma. She was a fair woman, she believed in treating everyone the same, and I think that's why she did it that way. But my siblings don't see it that way. Almost immediately after the inheritance was announced, Jason and Emma both started acting differently. First, there was this awkward silence, almost like they were sizing me up, waiting to see if I'd make a move. Then, they each came at me, in their own ways, with ideas about how the money should be divided. Jason, being the oldest, took a responsible angle. He told me he should get a bigger share because, as the eldest, he's the man of the family and has responsibilities that I supposedly don't understand. He likes to paint himself as the wise one who knows best, even though his life doesn't exactly reflect that wisdom. I know for a fact he's got debt piled up from his own bad choices, but according to him, he's the only one who can be trusted to use this money for good. Emma, on the other hand, played the sympathy card. She has this way of making her life sound harder than anyone else's, which isn't new. She told me that I don't really need the money as much as she does, subtly suggesting that, since she's had it rough, it would only be right if I let her have a bigger cut. The whole conversation with her was laced with this passive-aggressive guilt trip, and it was clear she was hoping I'd just roll over and agree. I could feel the pressure mounting, but it didn't stop there. My parents eventually got involved, and I think that's when I realized just how deep this was going to go. They had that, let's all sit down and talk tone, which I know all too well. It's never actually a discussion, it's more of a way to soften the blow when they want me to do something. They started by reminding me of all the times I'd been the bigger person, how I'd always done what was right for the family. They didn't say it outright, but it was clear they were expecting me to do the right thing again and let Jason and Emma take more than their share. Now, I'm not some big spender with money to burn. I'm not rolling in cash or living this carefree lifestyle. I've got student loans hanging over my head, and the reality is, this inheritance could actually make a difference for me. But every time I brought that up, I was met with blank stares or awkward silence, like they couldn't understand why I'd even bring it up. It's as if, in their minds, I'm just supposed to keep sacrificing without question. The funny thing is, this isn't even the first time something like this has happened. Growing up, I was always the one who stepped back, let things go, and did what everyone else needed. I've lost count of the times I missed out on things I wanted, just to keep the peace. This inheritance situation, though, it's making all of those old memories come back, and it's not a good feeling. The final push came when I confided in a friend who practically demanded I start seeing a therapist. I didn't think I needed it at first, but after everything came spilling out, I could see just how much this bigger person act had weighed on me. My therapist has been trying to get me to set boundaries, something I never thought I'd have to do with my own family. I'm still working through it, but I've started realizing that maybe being the bigger person all the time isn't actually helping anyone, least of all me. So here I am, caught between wanting to keep the peace and feeling like I'm finally ready to stand up for what's mine. I've kept quiet about this inheritance long enough, but it's time to draw a line. I can feel the tension building, and I know that if I make this choice, things might never go back to how they were. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's time for things to change. And that's where this story really begins. Update 1. So I tried to tackle things head-on with my family, hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could all sit down like adults and talk this through. I arranged a family meeting at my parents' house, thinking if everyone was present, we could get everything out in the open. I figured I'd explain my decision and why I was planning to keep my share of the inheritance. Naive, I know, but I genuinely thought that if I laid it out calmly, they'd at least listen. Turns out I couldn't have been more wrong. I barely had time to sit down before the backlash started. Jason, my older brother, was the first to jump in. He didn't waste any time making it clear he thought I was out of line. The words selfish and entitled got thrown around almost immediately. To him, the idea that I'd actually keep what was rightfully mine was basically an insult to our grandmother's memory. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that if I really cared about her legacy, I'd do the right thing and hand over my share to help out less fortunate family members. He didn't say it directly, but he was making it sound like I was the one ignoring family needs. Emma chimed in next, going for a different tactic. She's always been good at playing on emotions, and she didn't hold back this time. I watched as her face crumpled, tears welling up as she started talking about her financial situation. She went on about how tough things have been for her, how she's barely making ends meet, and how this inheritance could be the lifeline she desperately needs. She didn't look at me while she was talking, just stared down at her hands, letting her voice shake just enough to drive the point home. It was classic Emma, pulling on every heartstring she could reach. She practically made it sound like I was the reason she was struggling. Then my parents jumped in and, well, I can't say I was surprised by where they stood. They took Jason and Emma's side without hesitation. My dad, in that let's be sensible voice he uses, told me that as the middle child I should know what it means to be the adult in the room. My mom nodded along, looking disappointed, as if I'd somehow let them down just by wanting what my grandmother left me. The whole time, they kept glancing at each other, almost like they'd rehearsed this conversation before I'd even arrived. There wasn't a single moment where they even tried to understand where I was coming from. I was prepared for this, though. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, kept my voice steady, and explained, again, that I wasn't backing down. I told them this inheritance meant something to me too, and that I was planning to use it to pay off debts and secure my own future, just like they all wanted to. I made it clear I wasn't being selfish, I was just trying to take care of myself for once. But the more I spoke, the more the hostility in the room grew. It was as if my words were bouncing right off of them. Jason didn't let it end there. He looked at me with that self-righteous glare, the kind he saves for moments he thinks he's winning. He leaned forward and all but spat out that if I kept this up, he might just cut me off from the family altogether. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor, like I should thank him for the warning. I could feel the tension rising, but I held my ground, not saying a word. His words hung in the air, and I could tell he thought that would be enough to make me cave. Then Emma took it even further. Through her tears, she said that if I refused to give up my share, she would never speak to me again. She made it sound like I was forcing her hand, that I was the one breaking the family apart. I watched as her tears fell, one after another, and I could tell my parents were swayed by it. They started dropping hints, too, about how this decision of mine was going to destroy the family and drive a wedge between us all. They kept looking at me, waiting for me to crack, hoping I'd start feeling guilty and just give in. But I didn't. I sat there, letting them say everything they had to say. I knew that backing down now would just set a precedent for every future decision in my life. When they finally finished, I told them calmly that I understood their points, but I was still keeping my share. I could see the shock in their faces, especially Jason's. He didn't expect me to stand my ground. He stormed out of the room without a word, and Emma started crying even harder, repeating over and over that I was tearing the family apart. My parents went quiet, looking at each other as if they were unsure what to do next. They just sat there, not saying anything, but the disappointment in their eyes was clear. I stood up, told them I'd said what I came to say, and left. As I walked out, I could feel the weight of their silent judgment following me out the door. Later that evening, I got a text from my aunt. She'd heard about the whole situation and reached out, telling me she thought I was doing the right thing. It was the first time I felt like I had any support, and it gave me a bit of strength to keep going. Since then, my parents have started giving me the silent treatment. I know this tactic. They've used it before, hoping I'll come crawling back, apologizing for whatever I did to upset them. But this time, I'm not giving in. I've shared everything online, and the responses have been overwhelmingly supportive. It feels like, for the first time, people actually see my side. So, I'm holding firm. I'm not giving in, and I'm definitely not backing down. This is the line I'm drawing, and I'm sticking to it. Update 2. A week of silence passed after our tense family meeting. At first, I thought maybe they'd finally let it go, but I should have known better. The quiet didn't last. It started with a long, emotional text from Jason. He launched into a detailed story about his financial situation, saying how hard it's been for him to make ends meet. He even mentioned specific bills and debts, hinting that if he doesn't get some help soon, things could take a turn for the worse. He didn't directly ask me to give up my inheritance, but the implication was clear. I could make his life easier if I just gave him what he rightfully deserved as the eldest. It was as if he expected me to step in and fix everything for him. Emma wasn't far behind with her own dramatic twist. She didn't reach out to me directly. Instead, she went to my parents, telling them that she was on the verge of losing her apartment. Word spread quickly through the family that Emma's situation was dire, and it wasn't long before my parents got involved, calling me up to remind me of family values and responsibilities. They stressed that if I held on to my share, Emma could lose her place, maybe even end up homeless. I didn't respond to their message, but I could tell they expected me to cave. A few days later, things escalated. My family stopped inviting me to gatherings and events. I'd hear about birthdays and family dinners through mutual friends or social media, but I wasn't getting the usual invites. It was subtle, but it was clear they were trying to make a point. I was suddenly an outsider, and if I wanted back in, I'd need to correct my decision. Then came the gossip. Jason started spreading rumors within the extended family. He told anyone who'd listen that I was being greedy and disrespecting our grandmother's legacy. Before I knew it, I was fielding messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, each of them either disappointed or outright angry. I could tell they'd been fed a specific narrative, one that painted me as the selfish one for not helping out my siblings. It was overwhelming, but I reached out to my aunt, the one who had been supportive from the start. She was the only family member who seemed to understand my side, and she didn't hesitate to remind me that the inheritance was my decision alone. She told me that I was doing nothing wrong by keeping what my grandmother intended for me, and that the family's manipulation tactics were just that, manipulation. Her support gave me a renewed sense of determination. My friends were also a huge support. They reminded me that I'd spent my whole life prioritizing my family's needs over my own, and this was finally my chance to make a decision based on my happiness and well-being. Their encouragement helped me see that keeping the inheritance wasn't just about the money, it was about finally valuing myself and breaking free from years of putting everyone else first. My therapist, too, pointed out how important it was for me to establish boundaries. She commended me for standing my ground, reminding me that sometimes family can cross lines that friends or strangers wouldn't even consider. It felt validating to hear someone else recognize what I'd been going through, and it helped me realize that I didn't owe anyone my compliance, no matter how close we were. With all the pressure mounting, I started distancing myself from my family. I stopped responding to the manipulative messages and chose not to attend gatherings where I knew they'd push me to change my mind. It wasn't easy. It felt strange not showing up to family events and even stranger ignoring my parents' calls, but I knew I had to create some space if I wanted to make it through this. Financially, things were looking brighter. I started seeing just how much of a difference this inheritance could make in my life. I'd be able to pay off my student loans, start saving for a home, and even put some money toward career goals I'd been pushing aside. The more I focused on this vision, the more the guilt faded. I could finally see a future where I wasn't constantly sacrificing my dreams for someone else's comfort. It didn't stop my family from trying, though. I'd still get texts from Jason about his difficulties, and Emma continued her story about her apartment, hoping I'd change my mind. My parents kept pushing the narrative that I was tearing the family apart, but I refused to engage. I kept my responses brief, refusing to get pulled into their web of guilt and expectations. On Reddit, people's comments encouraged me to keep holding firm. Every time I shared an update, I'd get messages of support from people who understood what it was like to be in my shoes. Their stories and advice made me realize I wasn't alone in facing this kind of family dynamic, and I found comfort in knowing others had navigated similar situations successfully. In the end, I realized this was about more than just inheritance. It was about finally drawing a line, valuing my own worth, and setting a new standard for how I wanted to be treated. It was about breaking a cycle of guilt that had followed me my entire life. This inheritance was the first step in creating a life on my own terms, free from the constant expectation that I had to solve everyone else's problems. For the first time, I felt a sense of closure. I wasn't giving in to the demands or the guilt, and I was done explaining myself. My decision was final, and whether or not my family accepted it, I was prepared to move on and embrace this new chapter. If they couldn't respect that, then maybe it was time I stepped back and let them figure things out on their own. For once, I was choosing my peace over the drama, and I was more determined than ever to hold my ground. Update 3. My family invited me over for what I thought was just a normal dinner, but the moment I walked through the door, I could feel something was off. There was this tense silence in the air, with my parents, Jason and Emma, already seated in the living room. I'd barely set my bag down before they asked me to sit. That's when I realized this wasn't an ordinary family dinner, it was an intervention. Jason started first, and he wasted no time going in. He leaned forward, staring me down, and told me that what I was doing was a betrayal of the family. He called me selfish, entitled, and accused me of throwing our grandmother's memory away. He insisted that if she were still here, she'd want me to help them instead of hoarding the inheritance for myself. His words were harsh, and he made it sound like I was actively working against the family by refusing to share. It was clear he had spent time thinking about exactly what he wanted to say to hit the hardest. Then Emma chimed in, her voice already shaky. She didn't look at me but instead stared at the floor as she called me a bad brother for refusing to help her in her time of need. She talked about how difficult her life has been and hinted that I had always been the one person who could help keep things together. She said that by keeping the money, I was making things worse for her, as if my decision was single-handedly responsible for her problems. As they kept talking, my parents joined in, piling on their disappointment. My dad shook his head, telling me that he never expected this kind of selfishness from me, while my mom looked at me with this expression of pure sadness, like I'd let them down in the worst possible way. They both started talking about family unity, and how I was breaking that bond by choosing money over family. My dad went so far as to say I was dishonoring my grandmother's legacy. I listened to all of it without interrupting, just taking it in and letting them have their say. I'd come prepared to keep my calm, but I could tell they were all trying to provoke a reaction. After they had finished, I cleared my throat and calmly stated that I had no intention of backing down. I told them that I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but I was keeping my share of the inheritance, and that my decision was final. That's when my parents dropped the bombshell. Either I agreed to divide the inheritance with Jason and Emma, or I'd be cut off from the family indefinitely. They said it as if it were the simplest, most logical solution, like they'd all agreed that this was the only way to resolve things. Hearing them say that was a shock. I'd always known my family could be manipulative, but an outright ultimatum like that wasn't something I'd ever expected. As I sat there, my mind flooded with memories of all the times I'd sacrificed for them, the countless instances where I'd put their needs above mine. I remembered every time I'd bailed out Jason or supported Emma through one of her crises, and how none of it seemed to matter now. The only thing that mattered to them was getting their way. I took a deep breath, looked each of them in the eye, and repeated that I wasn't changing my decision. I said that if keeping my inheritance meant losing them, then that was something I'd have to accept. I don't think they believed me at first. Jason's face twisted in anger, and he stormed out of the room, muttering under his breath. Emma started crying, her shoulders shaking as she accused me of tearing the family apart. My parents just sat there in cold silence, staring at me with disappointment etched into their faces, almost like they were hoping their silence alone would make me cave. I stood up, nodded to them, and left the house. Walking out of there was harder than I expected. I'd grown up thinking that family meant sticking together no matter what, but this time it felt different. I knew that holding on to my inheritance might cost me my relationship with them, but I couldn't ignore that they'd been willing to cut me off over money. Later, I met up with a few close friends and told them what had happened. They listened, shocked, but completely supportive. They reminded me that family shouldn't come with conditions, and that I wasn't doing anything wrong by standing up for myself. Hearing that gave me a bit of comfort, though the weight of everything still hung heavy. Back at home, I shared the details of the intervention on Reddit. The responses were overwhelming. People kept telling me that real family wouldn't try to manipulate and guilt trip me like this, that it was brave of me to stand up for myself in such a toxic situation. Some even shared similar experiences with their own families, which reminded me that I wasn't alone in this struggle. The support was a huge relief, like I'd finally found people who understood. I'm not sure what happens next. I've made my decision, but whether my family will actually go through with cutting me off remains to be seen. Part of me hopes they'll come around, but if they don't, I know I'll be okay. This whole experience has shown me that sometimes the people you expect to stand by you can be the ones who hurt you the most. For now, I'm standing my ground. Update 4. Days stretched into a full week without a single message, call, or email from my family. After that last confrontation, I think they expected me to reach out first, but I didn't. The silence was both a relief and a constant reminder of the ultimatum they'd laid down. No one was budging. With the family pressure off, I noticed something strange happening. I actually started feeling better. Without the constant weight of worrying about everyone else's needs, it was like I could finally breathe again. My days were quieter, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of freedom. I didn't have to monitor every word or action, didn't have to step in to keep the peace. I was just living on my own terms. But that peace didn't last long. Emma, true to form, took her campaign against me online. She started posting cryptic status updates about greedy family members and made sure all her friends and followers saw every hint and tear-filled caption. People started reaching out, mostly family members I hadn't seen in years. The messages varied, some were disappointed, others outright angry, and all were based on the version of events Emma was pushing. They didn't know what really happened, only that she was painting me as the villain. Then my aunt came to the rescue. She must have seen the social media post because she called me up, this time sounding even more supportive and determined. She told me that my family's actions were manipulative, and that she'd seen this kind of thing before from them. She said that their disappointment was their own to deal with, not mine. I listened to her, and for the first time, it felt like someone from my family actually had my back. With my family's voices silent, my friends filled the gap, offering a different kind of support. They reminded me that I was finally choosing my own happiness. In their eyes, I wasn't a selfish person taking money away from others. I was just someone finally standing up for what was rightfully mine. They even organized a small gathering to celebrate my new independence. Just a casual hangout where I could actually relax. That night, I realized how much my self-worth had been tied up in my family's approval. Now, surrounded by people who didn't expect anything from me, I began to see things differently. Financially, everything was in place. I had my inheritance, untouched and ready to be used wisely. I started to consider what this money could actually do for me, pay off my student loans, secure a home, maybe even invest in things I'd been putting off. For the first time, it felt like a path was opening up in front of me, and I could see a future where I was living on my terms. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She'd seen the drama unfold on social media and wanted to reach out. She told me she understood what I was going through because years ago she'd experienced something similar. Turns out she too had been pressured by family, manipulated into making choices that weren't hers. She eventually cut off most contact, finding her own peace away from the drama. Hearing her story felt like looking into a mirror. I wasn't the first in the family to stand up against this cycle of guilt and control. Learning that this was a family pattern, one that had affected others too, was eye-opening. I realized that by standing my ground, I might actually be breaking a cycle that had been in place long before me. Hearing my cousin's story, I felt more determined than ever to hold my ground. Then, just as I was settling into this new reality, Emma reached out. She sent a simple, cryptic text, "We should talk." No apology, no explanation, just those 3 words. I stared at the message, wondering if this was a genuine olive branch or just another attempt to pull me back in. After everything, it was hard to tell. I decided to bring this up in my next therapy session. My therapist advised that I could hear her out if I wanted to, but only if I went in with clear boundaries. She reminded me that I didn't owe anyone my time or energy, especially not if it was going to drag me back into the same guilt and conflict. Her advice made sense, and I knew that if I chose to meet Emma, it would have to be on my terms. For now, though, I decided to stay in control of the narrative. To clear up any confusion among family and friends following Emma's posts, I shared a brief message of my own on social media. I explained that my decision was based on my own well-being and that I wouldn't be discussing private family matters in public. It was short, simple, and to the point. I wasn't about to get dragged into a public argument. So here I am, taking things one day at a time. I've held my ground, and I'm beginning to feel the strength that comes from truly valuing my own happiness. Whatever happens with Emma, or the rest of my family, I'm determined to keep moving forward on my own terms. Update 5. After Emma's cryptic text, I debated whether or not to respond, but in the end, I decided to meet up. I suggested a neutral spot, a quiet cafe downtown. I wanted a public place, somewhere where things couldn't easily spiral out of control. When I arrived, Emma was already there, sipping a coffee and looking deep in thought. She glanced up when I walked in, but there was no warm greeting, just a nod. I sat down, and there was a tense silence as we sized each other up. She finally started talking, telling me she wanted to explain her side. She said she hadn't intended for things to get so out of hand, but she'd been desperate. She went on about her financial struggles, explaining how this inheritance could fix everything for her. I listened without interrupting, watching her twist her coffee cup nervously as she laid it all out. Then she asked if I'd reconsider. Just a small part, she suggested. Enough to help her get back on her feet. She assured me she'd pay me back once things improved, as if that made it a fair deal. I could tell she was trying to sound sincere, but there was something rehearsed in her tone, like she'd practiced this speech before meeting me. I didn't say anything, just waited for her to finish. When she realized I wasn't responding, her tone shifted. She pointed out that she was family, and family was supposed to help each other. She made it sound like I was the one breaking some sacred rule by not giving in. She leaned in, her voice dropping as she reminded me of all the times I'd stepped in to keep the peace, to help her out. I could see her waiting for me to crack, for that familiar guilt to sink in, but I didn't. I kept my voice steady, told her I wasn't going to change my mind. I explained that I wasn't willing to sacrifice my own future, and that this inheritance had been left to each of us equally for a reason. Her expression shifted from pleading to something harder, colder. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Finally, she muttered something about how I was choosing money over family. She stood up abruptly, muttering under her breath as she grabbed her bag and stormed out. I stayed seated, watching her leave, feeling the eyes of a few nearby customers on me. I finished my coffee slowly, replaying the conversation in my head. This time, I didn't feel shaken or guilty. I felt like I'd done what I needed to do. A few days later, my mom reached out. Her message was brief, just a request to come over for one last talk. I agreed, not really sure what to expect, but knowing that I wanted to get some closure. When I arrived at my parents' house, it was just her and my dad waiting in the living room. They looked serious, but there was a softness to their expressions I hadn't seen in a while. They asked me to sit, and my mom began. She spoke quietly, telling me that she and my dad had been thinking a lot about the way things had escalated. She admitted they'd been unfair, that they'd pushed me in ways they shouldn't have. My dad nodded, adding that they hadn't considered how much this inheritance could mean to each of us individually. It was an apology, one I hadn't expected. My mom went on to explain that they had felt caught in the middle, wanting to support Jason and Emma, but also realizing now that I deserved respect for standing up for myself. They told me that no matter what, I was still their son, and they didn't want this to come between us. I sat there listening as they tried to mend the bridges that had been burned. I thanked them, and we talked for a while longer. By the time I left, I felt like things were finally settling, like maybe this fight wouldn't define our relationship after all. A few days later, Jason sent me a message. It was short, just an acknowledgement of everything that had happened and a reluctant admission that maybe he'd gone too far. There was no apology, but it was as close as I expected from him. Emma, however, stayed silent. I didn't hear from her, and after that meeting in the cafe, I didn't expect to. Maybe in time, but for now, I was done waiting. As for the rest of the family, I posted a simple message on social media, clarifying my stance one last time. I kept it straightforward, explaining that I'd chosen to honor my grandmother's wishes and was no longer discussing family matters publicly. The rumors and messages trickled down, and the extended family seemed to lose interest as the drama fizzled out. With everything quieting down, I started thinking more seriously about my future. I looked into a few financial options, considering investments and paying off my student loans. My friends celebrated with me, knowing this decision Jasoned a huge shift. I'd finally set boundaries, and I was standing by them. In the end, this experience taught me more than I ever expected about family, loyalty, and self-worth. I had spent years keeping the peace, always bending to accommodate others, and it had cost me more than I realized. This inheritance battle had been about more than money. It had forced me to see my own worth and to demand respect where I hadn't before. Now, I'm moving forward, focused on building a life that's true to me. Family will always be important, but I'm no longer sacrificing myself for their approval. I'm finally standing on my own, ready to move forward with strength and peace. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and for as long as I can remember, my family has always revolved around my younger sister, 24F. She's the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. From the moment we were kids, it was clear she was their favorite. She excelled at everything, academics, sports, social life, you name it. And my parents? They made sure everyone knew. Every parent-teacher conference, every holiday, every family gathering, it was all about her. Meanwhile, I was just there. It wasn't like I was completely ignored, but I wasn't supported either. Growing up, I struggled a lot in school, and it wasn't until I was 23 that I got diagnosed with ADHD. That diagnosis answered a lot of questions, but as a kid, all it meant was being constantly compared to my sister. Where she got A's, I barely scraped by with C's. Where she was getting soccer trophies, I was losing interest halfway through practices. Looking back, it's like I was set up to fail. She got tutors when she struggled. I got lectures about applying myself. She got extra spending money for being responsible. I got grounded for being careless with my allowance. The worst part was the emotional distance. My parents didn't just favor her, they seemed outright disappointed in me. By the time I turned 18, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out the second I could. I wasn't angry, not really. I think I just accepted my place in the family. I kept the relationship minimal, birthday texts, holiday calls, the occasional visit, but every time I went home, it was the same story. They'd talk about her new internship, her promotions, her latest achievements, and when it came to me, silence. It was like I didn't exist unless they were asking about her. So while she thrived, I struggled to find my footing. College was rough, and I barely graduated. But one thing stuck. I'd always been fascinated with technology. I got into coding, mostly self-taught, and found myself drawn to creating tools that helped make life easier. I didn't have a grand plan at first, but I knew I wanted to work on something that mattered. That's when the idea for my startup came. It started as a side project, a simple app designed to help people like me, who struggled with focus and time management. Over time, it grew into something bigger. I poured every penny I had into it, working nights and weekends. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of setbacks. I reached out to my family once, just looking for some moral support or advice. That was a mistake. My mom told me I should focus on finding a real job. My dad suggested I talk to my sister, who was running a small marketing company at the time, to see if she could take me on. It wasn't even about the money. I just wanted someone to say they believed in me. Instead, I got a lecture about stability and responsibility. That conversation lit a fire under me. If they didn't believe I could do it, I'd prove them wrong. I sacrificed everything, time, relationships, sleep, to make it work. And after years of hustling, it finally paid off. The app started gaining traction. Investors took notice, and one day, I landed a deal that changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't scraping by anymore. My startup wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We got media coverage, awards, and a lot of attention. I remember seeing the first article about us and feeling this rush of pride. For once, I wasn't just her brother. I was something on my own. That's when my family came back into the picture. My parents, who hadn't called me in months, suddenly wanted to catch up. They were posting my success stories on Facebook, tagging me in old photos, and talking about how proud they were. My sister, who hadn't shown much interest in what I was doing before, started reaching out too. It felt weird. For years, I was invisible to them, and now they couldn't stop calling. They'd bring up how they always knew I'd make it or how they knew I had potential, but I couldn't forget how dismissive they'd been when I needed them most. I kept things civil but distant. I wasn't sure how to handle it. Part of me wanted to let it go, to just enjoy the newfound attention and validation. But another part of me couldn't shake the resentment. They didn't care when I was struggling. They only cared now that I was successful. Eventually, I turned to Reddit. I didn't know where else to go. I laid it all out, the favoritism, the neglect, the sudden interest now that I had made it. I wasn't looking for validation. I just wanted to hear from someone who'd been through something similar. The responses were overwhelming. People shared their own stories, their own struggles with family dynamics and success. It was comforting, in a way, to know I wasn't alone. But it also made me realize something: I didn't owe them anything. This was just the beginning of the chaos. Update 1. The media coverage of my startup had barely gone live before my phone started blowing up. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered I existed. My inbox was flooded with congratulatory messages, awkward check-ins, and a surprising number of "hey, we should catch up" texts. At first, I was overwhelmed. Some messages were genuinely nice, but most of them felt off, like they were less about celebrating my success and more about what they could get out of it. The first call that caught me off guard was from my sister. We hadn't talked much since I moved out, except for the occasional family event where she'd tell me how busy she was with her business. This time, she started with a warm, almost overly enthusiastic tone. She wanted to catch up and hear about my app. It didn't take long for the conversation to shift, though. She asked if I'd considered collaborating with her company. She hinted at how a partnership could help both of us grow, but the subtext was clear: she wanted in. A day later, I noticed my parents had posted about me on Facebook. They were sharing links to articles about the startup, captioned with things like, "So proud of our son. We always knew he'd do great things." It felt bizarre. These were the same people who once brushed off my work as a hobby. Now they were acting like my biggest cheerleaders. The strangest part came when they invited me to dinner. This was out of character. We hadn't had a proper family dinner in years. Still, I went, partly out of curiosity and partly because I figured it was better to face whatever was happening head on. The dinner started awkwardly. My mom had gone all out, cooking my favorite childhood meals. They acted warm, attentive, and overly interested in my life, something I wasn't used to. But as the evening went on, the conversation inevitably turned to my financial situation. My dad casually mentioned how much my success must have changed things for me and hinted that I could give back to the family. My mom chimed in, talking about how a small loan could help them with a few house updates they'd been putting off. I tried to keep it polite but firm, explaining that every penny was going back into the business for now. They nodded, but the air grew noticeably colder. Then came the gaslighting. My mom said things like, we always believed in you, and my dad added, we knew you had it in you from the start. It was like they'd erased the years of dismissiveness and replaced them with a fantasy where they'd been supportive all along. I couldn't let it slide. I reminded them of the times I'd reached out for help or advice, only to be brushed off. I even mentioned some of their exact words, like when my mom had suggested I get a real job. That shut down the conversation fast. My dad changed the subject, and my mom just stared at her plate. That night, I updated Reddit about the dinner. The support was overwhelming. People validated my experience and encouraged me to stick to my boundaries. Reading their stories made me feel less alone and more determined to stand my ground. A few days later, my sister sent a long, angry text. She called me stingy and accused me of not valuing family. She brought up how she'd helped me in the past, though the only help I could remember was her suggesting I apply for an entry-level position at her company when I first started my startup. Her message ended with something about how family was supposed to come first. That was the final straw for me. I realized I couldn't navigate this alone, so I booked my first therapy session. The therapist helped me unpack a lot: my resentment, my guilt, and my need to set firmer boundaries. It was a relief to have someone help me make sense of it all. Meanwhile, my business kept growing. We landed another major deal, which brought in more investors and solidified our position in the industry. But with that success came more family drama. My parents came up with the idea of starting a family fund. They suggested we all contribute to it and share the benefits. It was framed as a way to strengthen our bond, but it felt more like a ploy to access my money. I refused outright. That decision didn't go over well. My parents started spreading their version of events to extended family, painting me as selfish and ungrateful. Aunts, uncles, and cousins began calling, some to scold me and others to guilt-trip me into reconsidering. One even said, "You're successful because of how your parents raised you. The least you can do is give back." I didn't bother defending myself to them. Instead, I doubled down on my decision to focus on my chosen family, my friends, colleagues, and the people who genuinely supported me. It wasn't easy, but every day I felt a little more confident that I was doing the right thing. By the end of that week, I decided one thing: I wasn't going to let my family rewrite history, and I wasn't going to let them guilt me into giving up what I'd worked so hard to build. Update 2. Not long after the whole family fund fiasco, things took an even stranger turn. My parents and sister started crafting a completely different version of events, one where they'd been my biggest supporters all along. It began with subtle changes. Posts on Facebook about raising 2 successful kids and old photos of me with captions like, "We always knew he'd do great things." It didn't stop there, though. They started tagging me in these posts, adding little anecdotes about how they had encouraged me to follow my dreams and supported me when times were tough. It was surreal to read, especially knowing how dismissive they'd been during my startup's early days. They acted like they were part of the journey when, in reality, they'd been completely absent. The worst was when they posted a throwback photo of my high school graduation. They weren't even there that day. They'd skipped it to attend one of my sister's soccer tournaments, something they had justified by saying, "She has a real shot at a scholarship." Seeing that photo with a caption about how proud they'd been of me made my stomach turn. I shared this on Reddit, detailing the photo and what actually happened. The response was overwhelming. People couldn't believe the audacity of my family. Some even shared their own stories of relatives rewriting history for clout, which helped me feel less alone. That's when I realized just how much of this behavior was about their need to seem relevant in my success. While all this was happening, my therapist helped me unpack a lot. She pointed out that their behavior wasn't about me at all. It was about them trying to regain control of the narrative now that I didn't need them anymore. That insight didn't make their actions okay, but it helped me see the bigger picture. Still, the constant drama was wearing me down. I started to seriously consider going no contact, but the idea of cutting them off completely felt overwhelming. The guilt lingered, even though I knew it was what I needed. In the middle of this mess, my company hit another major milestone. We won an award for innovation in accessibility tech, which brought a new wave of attention to both me and the business. It should have been a moment of celebration, but it only added fuel to the fire. One day, I was in the office when my assistant rushed in, looking flustered. She whispered that 2 people claiming to be my parents were in the lobby, demanding to see me. I was stunned. They hadn't told me they were coming, and I definitely hadn't invited them. When I went out to the lobby, they were waiting there, looking completely out of place among the sleek decor and professional atmosphere. My dad was gesturing wildly, trying to convince the receptionist to let them in, while my mom stood there with a forced smile. My team was watching from behind their desks, clearly uncomfortable. I walked up to them and calmly asked why they were there. They launched into a spiel about how they just wanted to congratulate me in person for the award. It was clear they wanted to make a scene, and I wasn't going to let that happen. I thanked them for stopping by but told them they couldn't just show up unannounced. When they tried to argue, I firmly asked them to leave. The whole thing was embarrassing, but it reinforced something for me. I needed stricter boundaries. Things escalated further when I found out my sister had launched her own app. It was eerily similar to mine, down to some of the features we'd spent years refining. She was marketing it as her passion project, but it was clear she was trying to piggyback off my success. I immediately got my lawyers involved. They reviewed everything and advised me to take legal action if necessary. It was a tough call. On one hand, I didn't want to escalate things further. On the other, I couldn't let her undermine everything I'd worked for. The stress from all of this took a toll on me. I started having trouble sleeping and found it harder to focus at work. My therapist suggested taking a short break, so I stepped back from day-to-day operations for a couple of weeks. It helped, but the drama wasn't over. I posted about the office incident on Reddit, and the story blew up. Thousands of people shared their own experiences with family members showing up unannounced, trying to stake a claim in their lives. It went so viral that my family started getting backlash from people who recognized the story. They were furious and blamed me for airing our dirty laundry. That's when I decided I couldn't leave anything to chance. From that point on, I started documenting every interaction with them. Every call, every text, every visit, I kept a record of it all. I didn't know what might happen next, but I wanted to be prepared for anything. By the end of it, I realized I couldn't keep playing their game. It was time to take control of my life, even if it meant making some hard choices. Update 3. Things were starting to settle down, or so I thought. My boundaries were holding strong, and my family had gone quiet after the fallout from their surprise office visit. Then I got a message from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. She started with small talk. but it quickly became clear she had something important to share. She told me that my grandfather, who passed away when I was a teenager, had left behind a significant inheritance. I vaguely remembered hearing something about it back then, but I never thought much of it. According to her, the inheritance was supposed to be split equally between me and my sister, except that's not what happened. My cousin explained that my parents had quietly funneled the majority of the money into my sister's education and career, leaving almost nothing for me. She wasn't just going off rumors either. She had proof, old bank statements showing withdrawals from accounts linked to the inheritance, all directed toward expenses like my sister's private school tuition, sports camps, and even a down payment on her first apartment. I was floored. Growing up, my parents had always made it clear that money was tight. When I asked for help with school or extracurriculars, they'd say they couldn't afford it. Meanwhile, my sister was getting top-tier everything, no questions asked. Now I knew why. I immediately reached out to my lawyer. I wanted to know if there was any way to hold them accountable. After reviewing the documents my cousin provided, he confirmed that I had a strong case. The inheritance was legally supposed to be divided equally, and my parents had clearly violated those terms. Before taking any legal action, I decided to confront them directly. I called and asked if we could meet. They sounded hesitant but agreed. We met at their house, and I brought copies of the bank statements with me. When I showed them the evidence, their reactions were predictable. At first, they denied everything, accusing my cousin of lying and claiming I was just trying to stir up trouble. But as I laid out more proof, withdrawal dates, amounts, and matching expenses, they couldn't keep up the act. Eventually, they admitted to using the money for my sister's benefit. Their justification: she had so much potential, and they didn't think I'd need it as much. They actually said they assumed I wouldn't amount to much anyway. Hearing that was like a punch to the gut. My sister, who had apparently been listening in from the other room, came out to join the conversation. She didn't apologize or even seem surprised. Instead, she doubled down, saying she deserved the money because she'd worked harder and was more successful at the time. She even accused me of being ungrateful for everything my parents had done for me. That was the breaking point. I left without saying much and went straight home. Later that night, I posted about the situation on Reddit, keeping it anonymous but including enough details for people to understand. The post exploded. Thousands of people weighed in, with most urging me to take legal action. Some shared similar stories of inheritance drama, which helped me feel less alone. After a lot of thought, I decided to move forward with the lawsuit. My lawyer filed the paperwork, and the fallout was immediate. My parents and sister went into full damage control mode, spinning the story to make me look like the villain. They told extended family members that I was suing them out of greed, conveniently leaving out the part where they'd stolen my inheritance. The calls and messages from relatives started pouring in. Some demanded to know why I was tearing the family apart, while others tried to guilt-trip me into dropping the case. One aunt even suggested I was being ungrateful, saying, "Your parents did the best they could. Why can't you just let it go?" I ignored all of it. Instead, I focused on the overwhelming support I was getting from strangers online and from the people in my life who truly cared about me. My friends were incredible, stepping up to remind me that I wasn't in the wrong. My therapist also played a huge role, helping me manage the emotional toll of the lawsuit. But it wasn't easy. There were days when I questioned whether it was worth it. The stress of the legal process, combined with the constant attacks from my family, made it hard to focus on anything else. Still, I knew I couldn't let them get away with what they'd done. In the meantime, my sister's app, which was suspiciously similar to mine, had completely flopped. Her launch had been rushed and poorly planned, and she'd lost a significant amount of money trying to compete with me. I couldn't help but wonder if that played a role in their renewed hostility. As the lawsuit progressed, I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every message, every call, I kept meticulous records to protect myself. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. By the end of it all, I realized this wasn't just about the money. It was about standing up for myself and finally breaking free from the toxic dynamics that had defined my relationship with my family for so long. Update 4. The fallout from the lawsuit turned my family dynamic into a full-blown circus. My parents and sister began bombarding me with calls and texts at all hours. Some messages were dripping with guilt-tripping, full of lines like, "How could you do this to your own family?" Others were outright hostile, accusing me of being greedy and vindictive. It didn't stop there. My parents began threatening to countersue for defamation, claiming I was damaging their reputation. It was laughable, considering the mountain of evidence I had to back up my case. My lawyer wasn't concerned, but the threat still added an extra layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. The real kicker came when my sister took things public. She went on a rant across her social media platforms, painting me as the villain. She claimed I was trying to ruin the family, that I was obsessed with money, and even threw in some fake stories about how much my parents had sacrificed for me. Her posts were riddled with inaccuracies, but they stirred up plenty of drama among mutual connections. I brought all of this to my therapist, who helped me see what was really going on. She explained that their behavior wasn't about me, it was about their insecurities. They couldn't handle losing control of the narrative and were lashing out because they felt exposed. It was a breakthrough for me. For the first time, I realized I didn't have to keep engaging with them. That week, I took the biggest step yet. I went no contact. With my lawyer's help, I drafted a formal no-contact letter and sent it to my parents and sister. It clearly outlined my boundaries and warned them not to contact me again. The silence that followed was deafening and liberating. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't lighting up with their calls and texts. There were no new social media posts targeting me, no more underhanded comments through extended family. It felt like I could finally breathe. With the drama out of the way, I had the space to focus on the people who truly mattered. My friends, who had been my rock through all of this, became even more like family to me. I spent more time with them, strengthening those relationships and realizing how lucky I was to have their support. Meanwhile, my startup hit another major milestone, earning industry recognition for its innovative work. It was a huge win, and for once, I was able to celebrate without the shadow of my family hanging over me. To my surprise, a few extended family members reached out privately. They apologized for how my parents and sister had treated me, expressing their support and even offering to testify on my behalf if needed. Their words didn't undo the hurt, but they were a small reminder that not everyone in my family shared the same toxic mindset. One evening, I sat down with a notebook and began writing everything I'd been holding in for years. Memories of feeling invisible as a kid, the constant comparisons to my sister, the outright neglect, all of it came pouring out. It was cathartic, like letting go of a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. As I wrote, one memory stood out. I was about 16, and it was the night of my school's annual awards ceremony. I wasn't expecting much, just a certificate for perfect attendance. My parents were supposed to come, but at the last minute they said they couldn't make it. My sister had a soccer practice they couldn't miss. I stood on that stage alone, looking out at an audience of proud parents, feeling like the only kid who didn't matter. I shared that story on Reddit, and the response was overwhelming. People flooded the comments with their own stories, many echoing similar experiences of being overlooked or treated as an afterthought. It was heartbreaking, but also incredibly validating. Inspired by the support I received, I decided to hold a small closure ceremony for myself. I gathered old family photos, mementos, and letters, and in a private moment, I burned them. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about letting go of the hold it had on me. As I moved forward, my Reddit posts began to take on a new life. They started inspiring others to set boundaries with their own toxic families. People messaged me, thanking me for sharing my journey and telling me how it had helped them find the courage to stand up for themselves. With the drama behind me, I poured my energy into my business and personal growth. I had more time to focus on what truly mattered, and the results spoke for themselves. My company thrived, and I felt more at peace than I ever had before. In my final Reddit update, I thanked everyone who had supported me through this journey. Their encouragement had been a lifeline during some of the toughest moments. As I closed the chapter on my relationship with my family, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for my chosen family, for my success, and for the freedom to finally live life on my own terms. Update 5. A year after cutting ties with my family, life looks completely different, and for the better. My startup has grown beyond what I ever imagined. We recently expanded internationally, opening offices in Europe and Asia, and our team has more than tripled in size. We're now considered a leader in accessibility tech, and seeing the impact of our work has been one of the most rewarding parts of this journey. Amid all this professional growth, I've also found happiness in my personal life. Through a mutual friend, I met someone incredible. It started casually, grabbing coffee and chatting about shared interests, but it quickly grew into something more. They've been a grounding force, someone who genuinely supports me and understands my complicated history. For the first time, I'm in a relationship that feels healthy and supportive. Recently, I hosted a dinner for my closest friends, the people I now consider my chosen family. As we sat around the table laughing and sharing stories, I couldn't help but reflect on how much has changed. These are the people who've stood by me through everything: the lawsuit, the family drama, the highs and lows of building my company. Looking around, I realized that I finally have the family I always wished for, even if it's not the one I was born into. Despite going no contact with my immediate family, their drama still finds its way to me through the grapevine. Extended relatives occasionally reach out, either to gossip or to guilt me into reconnecting. From what I've heard, my parents are still spinning their narrative, blaming me for the fallout and claiming I've abandoned them. At first, hearing these rumors was frustrating, but therapy has helped me truly let go of the need for their approval. One of the most meaningful changes in my life has been my decision to give back. Inspired by my own struggles growing up, I started a scholarship fund for neurodivergent students. The fund focuses on providing resources and opportunities for young people who, like me, might otherwise fall through the cracks. Seeing the first group of recipients begin their journeys has been incredible. It feels like I'm helping create the support system I always wished I had. Around this time, a journalist reached out to me, wanting to do a feature on my life and the success of my company. While it was flattering, I decided to decline. I've worked hard to separate my personal life from my professional one, and I want the focus to stay on the work we're doing, not the drama that brought me here. That decision was reinforced during a recent public event. I was there to represent my company, and everything was going smoothly until I spotted my sister in the crowd. It was an unexpected and awkward moment. She approached me, and we exchanged polite small talk, nothing heated or dramatic, but it was clear there was a lot left unsaid. A few days later, she sent me a message. She admitted that she felt guilty about how her parents treated me but stopped short of offering a real apology. She explained that she was just doing what she thought was expected of her at the time and hoped I could understand. I read her message a couple of times before responding. I kept it brief, thanking her for reaching out but making it clear that I'd moved on and wasn't looking to reopen old wounds. As I reflected on the interaction, I realized that closure doesn't always come in the form of an apology, or even a conversation. Sometimes it's simply deciding for yourself that you're ready to let go. In my final Reddit post, I shared how far I've come since that first post. When I wrote it, I was overwhelmed and unsure of what to do, but the community here gave me the clarity and courage to stand up for myself. Setting boundaries wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I also shared some of the lessons I've learned along the way. Resilience isn't about being unaffected by pain, it's about finding the strength to move forward in spite of it. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or reconciling, sometimes it just means forgiving yourself for holding on too long. And happiness? It doesn't come from anyone else's approval, it comes from building a life you're proud of. The response to that post was incredible. One user messaged me, saying my story inspired them to leave their own toxic family situation. We exchanged a few messages, and hearing how my journey had helped them make a change was one of the most rewarding moments of this entire process. Now, I'm entering a new chapter. I've decided to step back from the day-to-day operations of my company to focus on personal projects. I want to explore new passions, spend more time with the people I care about, and continue giving back in meaningful ways. To everyone who followed my story, thank you. Your support made a world of difference. Knowing that my experience resonated with others and even helped some people take steps toward healthier lives has been the silver lining in all of this. This is the life I always wanted, one built on love, support, and growth. And for that, I'm endlessly grateful.